Imagine you've spent your whole life using a hammer. You're great with it. You can drive a nail into a joist with 2 swings. You know exactly how the weight feels in your palm, and you've never once stopped to ask what a hammer is in its soul. You just use it. Then, one day, you're standing there mid-swing and the world glitches. You look at the tool in your hand and suddenly the word hammer doesn't mean anything. You start wondering what it means for the hammer to be a hammer rather than just a hunk of wood and steel. You look at the wall, the floor, your own hand, and you realize you've been swimming in a sea of things without ever once grasping the isness that makes them things in the first place. That's the moment Martin Heidegger wants to trap you in. He's the guy who walks into the workshop, stops the music, asks why we've all forgotten the most important question in the history of thought. What does it actually mean to be? He starts off by telling us that we've basically ghosted the most fundamental question of philosophy. We've forgotten it, and not just by accident. We've developed a set of intellectual calluses. He calls them prejudices, that make the question of being seem like a waste of time. The Greeks, and Aristotle specifically, were obsessed with this. They wrestled with it like it was a physical opponent. But after them, the question didn't just get answered. It got buried under a layer of self-evidence. By the time we get to Hegel, being is treated like the most boring, empty concept in the bag. It's the is we use in every sentence. The sky is blue. I am hungry. That's a bad idea. And because we use it constantly, we think we understand it. Heidegger's first big move is to tell us that our average understanding of being is actually a mask. It's a vague, average kind of intelligibility that's actually a total enigma. We're like fish who've forgotten what water is because we're too busy swimming in it. He lays out 3 prejudices that have kept us in the dark. First, there's this idea that being is the most universal concept. In traditional logic, you define things by their genus and species. A human is a rational animal. Animal is the genus. Rational is the specific difference. But being isn't a genus. You can't put being at the top of a pyramid and hang everything else under it, because being is already there in the definition of the pyramid itself. It transcends every category. In medieval thought, they called it a transcendence, something that goes beyond everything else. But just because it's everywhere doesn't mean it's clear. In fact, Heidegger argues that because it's the most universal, it's actually the darkest concept of all. It's the background radiation of the universe, omnipresent, and, unless you have the right tools, completely invisible. The second prejudice is that being is indefinable. Traditional logic says you define something by pointing to a higher concept, but there's nothing higher than being. You can't say being is a type of something else, because that something else would also have to be. So, philosophers just shrugged and decided it couldn't be defined. Heidegger thinks that's a massive cop-out. He says that the fact we can't define being using old school logic doesn't mean we should stop asking. It means we need a new kind of logic. It means being isn't an entity or a thing among other things. If you're looking for being by trying to find a super object in the world, you're looking for a flashlight by trying to see the light it's throwing on the wall. You're looking in the wrong place. The third prejudice is the most dangerous. That being is self-evident. We all get what is means, right? If I say the sky is blue, you don't stop me and demand a 3-volume treatise on the word is. You just look up. But Heidegger points out that this understanding is totally superficial. It's what he calls pre-ontological. We have a factical grasp of it. We can navigate the world, but we don't have a thematic grasp. We're like people who can drive a car perfectly but have no idea how an internal combustion engine works. We're operating on a know-how that hides a deep know-nothing. The very fact that we find it self-evident is the proof that we're living in a state of profound ignorance. It's a covert judgment of common reason, as Kant might say, that keeps us from ever looking at the foundation. So, how do we fix this? Heidegger decides we need a formal structure for the inquiry. Every inquiry is a seeking. If you're looking for your keys, you already have a rough idea of what keys are, or you wouldn't know when you found them. This is his way of dealing with the circular reasoning trap. People love to point out that if you're asking about being, you already have to understand being to some degree to ask the question. Heidegger says, yeah, exactly. That's not a bug. It's a feature. We already live in an understanding of being. It's a fact. We're already guided beforehand by what we're looking for. Isn't to prove being from scratch, but to make this vague, average understanding transparent to itself. Relatedness backward or forward between the inquirer and the inquired about. He breaks the question down into 3 parts. First, there's the gefracts. What is asked about? That's being itself. Second, the befracts. The thing we interrogate to get the answer. We can't just interrogate being directly because it's not an object. We have to interrogate an entity. But which one? Everything is. Rocks are, numbers are, unicorns are, in a way, and we are. Heidegger argues that we have to pick an entity that has a special relationship to being. That entity is us. He gives us a specific name for ourselves. Dasein. It's a German word that literally means being there. He doesn't want to use man or human or subject because those words are already loaded with centuries of baggage. Dasein is the entity that doesn't just exist, but for whom its own being is an issue. A rock doesn't wonder about its rockness. A cat doesn't have an existential crisis, but Dasein, we're the ones who ask, what am I doing here? What does this mean? Being is disclosed to us. We're the only entity that cares that it is. Finally, there's the erfracht, what is to be found out, the meaning of being. Heidegger's whole project is to use Dasein as the gateway to get to the meaning of being in general. This is what he calls fundamental ontology. All other ontologies, the study of the being of nature, the being of math, the being of history, have to be grounded in this. Now, why does this matter? Why isn't this just academic navel-gazing? Points to the sciences of his time, the 1920s, and says they're all in crisis. Physics, biology, theology, they've all hit a wall. Why? They've reached the limits of their basic concepts. Physics is wrestling with the nature of matter and space. Think relativity. Ontology is trying to define what life actually is beyond just mechanical movement. G is realizing that its foundations are often borrowed from a Greek philosophy that doesn't actually fit the experience of faith. These sciences are ontical. They deal with facts and entities, but they rest on ontological foundations. The basic structures of the areas of being they study. When a science hits a crisis, it's because its ontological foundation is tottering. You can't fix a house if the ground it's built on is shifting. Heidegger argues that we need a productive logic that leaps ahead of the sciences and lays the groundwork. We need to clarify the meaning of being before we can really understand the being of nature or the being of history. Otherwise, we're just limping along, collecting data without knowing what the data is actually of. Ontology is the a priori condition, the beforehand stuff that makes the ontical sciences possible. If you don't know what life is, your biological research is eventually going to hit a ceiling. If you don't know what time or history is, your historiography is just a collection of dates. This brings us to the priority of the question. Heidegger says it has two types, ontological and ontical. The ontological priority is what we just talked about. It's the foundation for every other branch of knowledge. But the ontical priority is where it gets personal. Dasein is ontically distinctive because it is ontological by its very nature. That's a bit of a mouthful, but here's the unpack. We are the only beings whose existence is defined by the fact that we understand existence. We don't just occur like a rock in a field. We exist. Heidegger reserves the word existence, existens, specifically for Dasein. Things like hammers or stars have a different kind of being. They're just there. But Dasein has its being to be. It's something we have to take hold of or neglect. We're always a possibility. We can be authentic, actually choosing who we are, or inauthentic, just drifting along with the crowd. Because our being is an issue for us. We already have a pre-ontological understanding of being. We're already being ontological. This is the ontico-ontological priority of Dasein. We're the condition for the possibility of all other ontologies because we're the ones doing the asking. If there's no Dasein, There's no question of being. Being isn't some abstract thing floating in space. It's always the being of an entity. We're the only entity that can disclose it. Heidegger introduces a crucial distinction here between the existentiel and the existential. Don't let the similar sounds trip you up. Existential is the ontical stuff. It's your personal life, your specific choices, your affairs. Whether you decide to be a baker or a thief, whether you're brave or a coward in a specific moment, that's existential. Existential, on the other hand, refers to the structures that make those choices possible. It's the analytic of the constitution of Dasein. The existential is the framework. The existential is the content you pour into it. Heidegger's goal in being and time is an existential analytic. He's not here to give you life advice or tell you how to live your existential life. He's here to map the existential hardware that lets you have a life in the first place. He even gives a nod to the heavyweights of the past to show he's not just making this up. He points to Aristotle, who said the soul is, in a certain way, entities. Aristotle saw that the human soul has this weird capacity to come together with everything else, to understand it, to perceive it, to be it in a sense. Thomas Aquinas picked up on this too, arguing that the soul is properly suited to come together with entities of any sort. They sensed that Dasein has a priority, even if they didn't quite have the tools to dig into its ontological structure. They saw the soul as the place where being shows up. Heidegger is just taking that ancient intuition and radicalizing it. So, here's the thriller setup. We are the only things in the universe that can ask the question that makes the universe make sense. We've forgotten how to ask it because we're too comfortable with the is in our sentences. We're living in a world of things, the ontical, and ignoring the isness, the ontological, that lets them show up. To get back to the meaning of being, we have to look in the mirror. We have to do a deep dive into our own existence, not as a list of facts about ourselves, but as a structural analysis of what it means to be there in the world. The circle of the inquiry. That we have to understand being to ask about being isn't a trap. It's the relatedness that proves we're on the right track. It's the business of philosophers to take this average understanding and make it transparent. We're going to interrogate Dasein because Dasein is the only thing that already knows the answer, even if it doesn't know it knows. It's a massive, high-stakes game of intellectual archaeology. We're digging through the prejudices of tradition, the crises of the sciences, the self-evidence of everyday life to find the horizon of meaning. And the kicker? The roots of this whole project are existential. This isn't just a theory. It's a possibility of the being of each existing Dasein. You're not just a student in a lecture. You're the befracts the entity under interrogation. The question of being isn't out there. It's the radicalization of a tendency that's already inside you. You've been asking it your whole life, every time you've wondered what you're doing here. Heidegger is just the guy who's going to make you stay in the room until you actually look at the question in the face. We're moving fast because, frankly, the clock is ticking on our existence. We're entities whose being is an issue. And if we don't figure out what that being means, we're just highly sophisticated machines neglecting our own most essential possibility. Ontological priority of this question isn't just about grounding physics or biology. It's about grounding us, making the is mean something again. And to do that, we have to start with the there in being there. We have to start with Dasein,